Hi, I'm Miss Davis, and we're back with lesson 5 of our guidebook unit, The Stories Julian Tells. Now, on our previous lesson, we identified Mary Ellen and Grandpa's feelings, character traits, and contributions to the events in the bee tree. So today, we're going to read a new story, The Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lesmore. And as we read, we're going to determine the meaning of the words using context clues, and we'll also practice sequencing the major events and character contributions in the story. So remember, we've done this before. We've sequenced events in the bee tree, and we've also talked about character contributions. And remember, each lesson prepares us for our culminating writing test and our end of the unit assessment. So for this lesson, the following things are what you will need: your reading log, your copy of The Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lesmore by William Joyce, and also your sequence of events organizers, which will probably be found in your student materials or resource booklet. So go ahead and get those things readily available. The first thing you'll need is your book, because we're going to read that first. So you're going to follow along in your book as I read the story, The Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lesmore, aloud. So as I read, I'm probably going to stop at different points in the story to kind of point out some things that may be important as we read this story. So here we are, The Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lesmore. Morris Lesmore loved words. He loved stories. He loved books. His life was a book of his own writing, one orderly page after another. He would open it every morning and write of his joys and sorrows, of all that he knew and everything that he hoped for. Now remember, it says it was one orderly page, so he was used to things being in order. But every story has its upsets. One day, the sky darkened, the winds blew and blew. So look, we can tell that something is going on because we use the word what? Upset. So we can think about something bad, because when we're upset, something bad has happened. So everything Morris knew was scattered, even the words in his book. Poor Mr. Lesmore. He didn't know what to do or which way to go. So he began to wander and wander. So he's just walking around trying to figure out what he needs to do, because he's used to his life being in order. Then a happy bit of happenstance came his way. Rather than looking down, as had become his habit, Morris Lesmore looked up. Drifting through the sky above him, Morris saw a lovely lady. She was being pulled along by a festive squadron of flying books. So here's Miss Lesmore looking all sad and black and gray. And here's a fine lady looking all vivid and colorful and festive. Morris wondered if his book could fly, but it couldn't. It would only fall to the ground with a depressing thud. The flying lady knew Morris simply needed a good story, so she sent him her favorite book. The book was an amiable fellow and urged Morris to follow him. So here's the book telling him, come on. The book led him to an extraordinary building where many books apparently nested. Morris slowly walked inside and discovered the most mysterious and inviting room he'd ever seen. It was filled with the fluttering of countless pages, and Morris could hear the faint chatter of 1,000 different stories, as if each book was whispering an invitation to adventure. Then his new friend flew up to him and landed on his arm. It held itself open, as if hoping to be read. The room rustled to life. And so Morris's life among the books began. So we can see something different is going on here, because he's not really dark and gray anymore. Morris tried to keep the books in some sort of order, but they always mixed themselves up. The tragedies needed cheering up and would visit the comedies. The encyclopedias, weary of facts, would relax with the comic books and fictions. All in all, it was an agreeable jumble. Morris found great satisfaction in caring for the books, gently fixing those with fragile bindings and unfolding the dog-eared pages of others. Sometimes Morris would become lost in a book and scarcely emerge for days. He still emerged in that book. Morris liked to share books with others. Sometimes it was a favorite that everyone loved. Other times he found a lonely little volume whose tale was seldom told. Everyone's story matters, said Morris, and all the books agreed. At night, after all the stories that needed telling had been told, and everyone had settled down to their proper places on the shelves, the great big dictionary would get in the last word. It was then that Morris would once again write in his own book. He wrote of his joys and sorrows, of all that he knew, and everything he hoped for. Same thing he was doing in the beginning of our story. The days passed, so did the months, and then years and years. So Mr. Lesmore is probably getting what? Old. And as Morris Lesmore became stooped and crinkly, he became more and more stooped and crinkly. But the books never changed. Their stories stayed the same. Now his old friends took care of him the way he had once cared for them, and they read themselves to him each night. So here we see Mr. Lesmore. He's gotten a little old now. Then one day he filled the last page in his book. He looked up and said with a bittersweet sigh, I guess it's time for me to move on. So he finished his book, and it was time for him to move on. The books were sorry, but they understood. Morris put on his hat and took his cane, and as he went to the door, he turned and smiled. Then he waved goodbye. I'll carry you all in here, he said, and pointed to his heart. The books waved their pages, and Morris Lesmore flew away. And as he flew away, he changed back to the way he had been that long ago day when they'd all first met. Looks similar to the page in the beginning of the story. The books were quiet for a while. Then they noticed that Morris Lesmore had left something behind. It's his book, said his oldest friend. Inside was Morris's story. All of his joys and sorrows, all that he knew, and everything he'd hoped for. Then the books heard a small expectant sound. There in the doorway was a little girl. She looked around with wonder. Then something fantastic happened. Morris Lesmore's book flew up to her and opened its pages. The girl began to read, and so our story ends as it began, with the opening of a book. So that was a good little story, Mr. Morris Lesmore, the Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lesmore. So hopefully you were paying attention as we read that. So now we're going to talk about some specific words that were talked about in our book. So what does the word upsets mean? Now we know what happens to us when we're upset, but it might be used in a different form in this quotation. So let's read this quotation from the book. His life was a book of his own writing, one orderly page after another. He would open it every morning and write of his joys and sorrows, of all that he knew, of everything he'd hoped for. But every story has its upsets. One day the sky darkened, the winds blew and blew. So when we think about the word upsets, what do we think about? Does it mean the same as like when we get mad? So does this mean but every story gets mad? Probably not. So when we think about it, we think about what it means using the clues in that. So what could upset mean here? So the quotation talks about writing about joys and sorrows and his life being orderly. So if something comes and upsets it, that means something what? Something bad happened. So here, the word upsets means that something bad has happened to change the sequence of events in the story. So instead of being mad right here, but every story has something bad to happen, we can replace it with that. And one day the sky darkened and the winds blew and blew. So that's where we have to be careful and use the context clues, because sometimes even though we know the meaning of a word, that's not how it's used specifically in this text or in this passage or in this story. So here, the word upset means something bad has happened. So now you're going to work with your partner to determine the meaning of scattered using context clues. You're going to record the word, its meaning, and the context clues that help you determine the meaning in your reading log. So you can turn to a page in your reading log and write the word scattered. And as you discuss with your partner while you're looking in the book, write down some things or jot down some things around the word scattered that can help you come up with the meaning of it as it is used in this text. So I'll give you a few minutes, maybe about 5 minutes, to work with your partner to write that down in your reading log. So you can pause right here and work on that for just about 5 minutes. Now, when we go back to the story, after we've talked about scattered and all of that, what are the first two major events in the fantastic flying books of Mr. Morris Lesmore? So think about the first things that happened. What were the first two things that happened? We're going to complete the character contribution sections of our graphic organizer. Okay, so we're talking about the things that happened. What are the things that happened in the beginning of the story? So we know that the first thing that happened is a what? A big storm came and destroyed his life in his story. So once the storm came, everything was out of whack. The pages in his book were messed up. The letters were messed up. Houses were turned upside down. So that's the first thing that happened. So after that big storm, what was the next major thing that happened? We know something happened in between. So after the storm happened, he finally wandered into what? A building filled with books. So those are the first two major events. So the storm happening and him finding his way to the building filled with books. So those are the first two major events that are very important to the things or the happenings in this story. So now you're going to work with your partner to fill out the last four major events in your sequence of events graphic organizer. So you're going to go from, we already have our first two. So you're going to think about for about 5 minutes or so the four major things, like the most important things that really happen in the story that lead to the ending or the other events that ultimately lead to the end of the story. So we have the first two, the storm and him making it to the building with all the books. So what would be the next four things that would happen in this story? So for about 5 minutes, we can pause right here and you can work with your partner to fill in this part of the graphic organizer. Okay, so for the next four things, you should have come up with, he begins taking care of the books. He starts writing, that would be the third thing. The fourth thing, he starts writing his story again. And then the fifth thing is he completes his story and decides to move on. And the last thing is the little girl starts reading his story. So we say the third thing could be that he starts taking care of the books. The fourth thing, he starts writing his book again. The fifth thing, he finishes his story and decides to move on. And then the little girl starts reading again. So once we have all of those events, we can go on to the next part of our lesson. So what did the flying lady do to make Morris find the building of books? So think about that in the story. I turn back to that page in the story, and you can work with your partner to fill out those character contributions part of your sequence of events organizer. So the flying lady contributed to the part of him getting to that building full of books. So as you work with your partner, look back in the story so you can fill in the character contributions part of your sequence of events organizer. So you come up with your events. Now you want to talk about the contributions of each character to those different events. So you'll have about roughly about 10 minutes to work on that part and finish that part of your graphic organizer. So we'll pause right here and we'll work with our partner and continue filling out our graphic organizer. Okay, so now that you've completed your graphic organizer, we have another question that we need to answer concerning the Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lesmore. How did different characters contribute to the events of the story? Now, we have quite a few characters that we might not consider characters, but we have Mr. Morris Lesmore, we have the Flying Lady, we have her book, we have the little girl, we have the books inside the story. So we have a couple of different characters in this story that contribute to the events of the story. So, what did the Flying Lady do? We know that she led Mr. Morris Lesmore to the building with the book. She gave her book. So, really, the Flying Lady and the Flying Book were both part of the contributions to that part, to Morris getting to the building full of books. So, the Flying Books, once he landed on his arm, he brought back that love for reading for Mr. Morris Lesmore. So he contributed to Mr. Lesmore beginning to write his story again once he read that book that the Flying Lady placed on it, that gave to him, that also landed on his arm. So after that, we know many of the characters Mr. Morris Lesmore contributed to the events in the story because he began sharing books with other people in the story, or the townspeople. So this also helped him as he was getting back his love, or he was getting his life back in order, because his life was orderly in the beginning. Then the storm came and messed everything up. But once he made it to that building, he started reading again, taking care of books. That led to the other events that led to the ultimate ending of our story. So remember, we have to be cautious about just vaguely thinking about what is going on in our story. We have to look into the details so we can find the contributions of each character. So as you're reading, remember, you're going to think about the different characters and how they contributed to the events in the story. So after we talk about that for a few minutes and you talk with your partner about it, then we'll come to the ending or the closing of our lesson. So we'll discuss that for a few minutes with your partner and we'll close our lesson. So, as we close our lesson, you learned about Morris Lesmore's experience with books. You also determined the meaning of words using context clues, and you sequenced the major events of the story, the Fantastic Flying Books of Mr. Morris Lesmore. So we have completed our first 5 lessons of our guidebook unit, The Stories Julian Tells.